Damien Vale didn't even look up from his phone when he said it. They were sitting at the dining table of the penthouse he owned, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows that swallowed the whole Manhattan skyline. And Evelyn had just told him, quietly, that she hadn't slept in 3 nights, that she felt like she was disappearing. He scrolled past something on his screen, tapped twice, then said without any particular emotion, "You're pathetic, you know that? 40 years old and you still need someone to hold your hand. Grow up, Evelyn." He got up, poured himself a drink, never looked at her once. If that sentence hits you somewhere deep, stay with me. This story doesn't end where he thinks it does. Watch until the very last moment, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The penthouse at 1045th Avenue had 42 rooms. Evelyn had counted them once, not out of admiration, but out of something closer to desperation. It was a Tuesday afternoon in February, and she'd walked from room to room with a cup of tea that went cold before she reached the halfway point, just trying to find somewhere in that enormous, immaculate space that felt like it belonged to her. She couldn't find one. There was Damien's study, with its walnut bookshelves lined with volumes he'd never read, but had a decorator select for their spines. There was the kitchen, designed by a Michelin-starred chef who came in twice a week to cook meals Damien often didn't come home to eat. There was the master bathroom with its Italian marble floors, and the soaking tub Evelyn had used exactly once in 7 years because the thing was so aggressively beautiful it made her feel like a guest in a hotel she couldn't afford. There was art on the walls, curated, framed, untouchable. And then there was Evelyn. She existed in the penthouse the way a piece of furniture exists, functionally, quietly, in whatever corner didn't interrupt the sight lines. She hadn't always been like this. Evelyn Carter, she still thought of herself by her maiden name sometimes, in the private language of her own head, had come to New York at 26 with a portfolio of paintings under her arm and the kind of stubborn, inconvenient ambition that other people find either inspiring or exhausting, depending on their mood. She'd done 2 years at the Savannah College of Art and Design, dropped out when the tuition became impossible, and spent the next 3 years waitressing in the Village and painting at 3 in the morning in a studio apartment the size of a generous closet. She wasn't famous. She wasn't even close to famous. But she was good. Genuinely, technically, emotionally good. In a way that a small number of people recognized and a larger number of people walked right past. She met Damien Vale at a gallery opening in Chelsea. He was 34, already rich in that quiet, consolidated way that doesn't need to announce itself. He had a way of standing in rooms that made him look like he was evaluating them rather than participating in them. Cool eyes. Good jaw. The kind of man who made you feel, when he focused on you, like the only person worth talking to on the planet. He'd stopped in front of one of her pieces, a medium-sized canvas, mostly blues and slate grays, a woman standing in a doorway with her back turned, and stood there for almost 4 minutes without speaking. Then he turned to her, because somehow he already knew she was the painter, and said, "What's she looking at?" Evelyn had said, "I don't know. I just know she can't make herself walk through." He'd looked at her for a long moment after that. Really looked. "I'll take it," he said. She should have paid more attention to the fact that he'd said, "I'll take it," and not, "I'd like to buy it." But she was 29, and he was looking at her like she was worth seeing, and that felt, at the time, like enough. They were married 14 months later. The wedding was in the Hamptons, at a property owned by Damien's family, and it was beautiful in the way that expensive things engineered by other people are beautiful. Coordinated, abundant, faultlessly executed. Evelyn wore a dress she'd helped design herself, a simple ivory column with hand-embroidered details along the collar, and she'd been genuinely happy that morning. She remembered that clearly. Nervous in the ordinary human way, but happy. Her mother had flown in from Ohio and stood next to her before the ceremony and said, "Baby, are you sure about him? He seems like a lot." Evelyn had laughed it off. "He's not a lot. He's just focused." "Men who are that focused usually aren't focused on you," her mother had said, not unkindly. Evelyn had kissed her cheek and walked out into the June sunlight and married him anyway. For the first 2 years, she told herself things were good, and some of it was true. Damien could be attentive when he wanted to be. He remembered details about her work that surprised her, asked questions that showed he'd actually been listening, brought her coffee exactly the way she liked it on Sunday mornings without being asked. There were trips to Florence, to a rented villa in the Algarve, to a tiny fishing village in Brittany where they walked for hours along cliffs, and he held her hand and nobody knew who he was, and she loved him in a clean, uncomplicated way. But even then, even in the good years, there was something underneath it that she couldn't quite name. A quality of distance, like he was always slightly behind glass, present enough to seem real, removed enough that you could never quite get your hands on him. She started to notice, in year 3, that the way he spoke about her in public had shifted, not dramatically, just a small, consistent movement in a particular direction. At dinners with his colleagues, she became my wife, then Evelyn, then occasionally just a gesture in her direction when her name didn't come up quickly enough. He stopped asking about her painting. He started scheduling her out of events she'd previously attended with him. Not explicitly, not cruelly, just by not mentioning them until after they'd happened. She told herself she was being sensitive. She told herself successful men were complicated. She told herself she loved him, because she did, in the reduced and battered version of the feeling that remained after years of being slowly made smaller. Then Serena Blake appeared. Serena was 31 to Evelyn's 36, with the kind of effortless social ease that Evelyn had never possessed and had stopped pretending to want. She was a publicist, Damien's publicist, technically, hired to manage the communications around his company's expanded media profile. She was brilliant at her job, quick, intuitive, relentlessly charming. She walked into rooms like she expected them to reorient around her, and mostly they did. Evelyn met her at a business dinner in the spring of their 6th year of marriage. She'd noticed the way Damien's posture changed when Serena walked in. A small, almost imperceptible opening, like a door coming slightly off its latch. She'd noticed the way he laughed differently around Serena. Easier. More himself, or at least a version of himself that felt newer and less defended. She hadn't wanted to see it at first. She was good at not seeing things, years of practice. But by their 7th anniversary, she couldn't pretend anymore. She didn't catch them. There was no shattering cinematic confrontation, no hotel room discovered, no lipstick on a collar. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse. It was the way Damien would come home from a late dinner, and his energy was different, lighter, almost satisfied, the way people feel after real conversation with someone who actually sees them. It was the way he'd started keeping his phone face down on the nightstand. It was a photograph she'd seen on Serena's Instagram, a shot from someone's rooftop party. Serena in a gold dress with her head thrown back laughing, and in the blurred background, unmistakably, Damien's profile. She brought it up on a Saturday morning. She was standing in the kitchen. He was reading something on his laptop. She set down her coffee cup very carefully, like she was worried about breaking something, and said, "Damien, what is happening between you and Serena?" He looked up. There was a brief, evaluating pause, the kind she'd learned to recognize. He was deciding how to handle her. "Nothing is happening," he said. "I've seen the way—" Evelyn, his voice was patient in the way that was designed to make her feel hysterical for asking. "She works for me. Stop doing this." "Doing what?" "Making everything about you. Constructing drama because you're bored. It's—" He stopped, looked back at his screen. "Just stop." She stood there for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and walked back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor. She did not cry. She was too tired to cry. After that conversation, something in Evelyn began, not breaking exactly, but compressing, like pressure building in a closed space. She began to pay attention in a different way, not looking for proof, not building a case, just watching. And what she saw over the following months was a portrait of a marriage that had become, on Damien's side, a matter of administrative convenience. He had her scheduled. She realized this slowly. She was present at events that required a wife present. She was absent from the ones that required flexibility. She handled the things in their domestic life that would be complicated to transfer to a staff member. The maintenance of certain relationships, his mother's birthday, the charitable commitments that required a personal touch. She did it without being asked because she'd been doing it for years and had simply never stopped. She understood one night while lying awake at 2 a.m, his infrastructure. She was the part of his life that ran smoothly, so he never had to think about it. and he had stopped thinking about her entirely. The night everything ended was their 10th anniversary. It was September. Damien had originally promised, back in the spring, that they'd go somewhere. He'd said it the way he said things he didn't mean to be held to, offhandedly, pleasantly, in the tone of a man making a deposit into an account he expected to forget about. By August, it was clear they weren't going anywhere. His company was preparing a significant acquisition, and his schedule was what it always was: absolute, non-negotiable. A force of nature that required everyone around him to simply accommodate. Evelyn had told herself it was fine. She told herself this about a great many things. She made reservations at a restaurant they'd been to on their first anniversary, a small Italian place in the West Village that had managed to survive a decade of Manhattan volatility. She put on a dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion, dark burgundy, cut simply. She did her hair. She sat at the kitchen table and waited. At 7:30, Damien texted, "Running late, give me an hour." At 8:50, he texted again, "This is going to go longer. Don't wait up." She sat at the kitchen table until after 9. The restaurant had called twice. She hadn't answered. When Damien came home at 11, Evelyn was still sitting there. She hadn't changed out of the dress. She hadn't poured herself a drink. She just sat there in the dark kitchen with the city lights coming through the windows, thinking. He walked in and stopped when he saw her. "Hey," he said. He set his jacket over the back of a chair. "You're up." "I made reservations," she said, "for 8 o'clock. "I know. I'm sorry. The meeting ran. It's our anniversary, Damien." He looked at her with that expression she hated, the one that meant he was about to deal with her instead of talk to her. "I know what day it is," he said. "Do you? Because I'm sitting here in a dress I bought for tonight, and I've been sitting here for 3 hours and—" Her voice broke, just slightly. She hated that it did. I feel like I'm invisible to you. I feel like I've been invisible to you for years, and I don't know when that happened, but it happened, and Evelyn, he interrupted her quietly. "I need you to see me. I need you to actually—" "Evelyn." She stopped. He reached for the ice bucket on the counter, dropped some ice into a glass, poured 2 fingers of whiskey. Didn't look at her while he did it. Then he turned around, leaned against the counter, looked at her with something that was almost pity, and said, "You're pathetic for needing this much attention. You're 40 years old. I don't know what you want me to do about the fact that you can't get through a Tuesday without needing emotional maintenance, but I don't have the energy for it. I just don't." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn sat very still. Something inside her that had been under tremendous pressure for a very long time simply stopped. Not broke. Stopped. Like a watch winding down to its last tick and going quiet. She looked at him for a moment. Really looked. The jaw she'd once loved. The eyes she'd once believed could see her. The man who had, at some point in the past decade, quietly decided she wasn't worth the bother of basic human decency. She stood up. "Okay," she said. "Okay what?" She walked past him to the bedroom. She pulled a suitcase from the closet. Not the largest one, not the matching set he'd bought in London, just a single mid-sized suitcase she'd had since before she knew him. She packed methodically. The things that were hers before he existed in her life. The painting she'd kept, not the one he'd bought at the gallery, he could keep that, but a small one she'd made the year before she met him, 2 feet by 2 feet, mostly ochre and burnt sienna. A woman's hands cupped around something that wasn't visible. Her grandmother's ring. Her hard drives. 3 sketchbooks. Clothes that were practical, that would be useful, that had nothing to do with his world. Damien appeared in the doorway while she was packing. He stood there watching her. "What are you doing?" "Packing." "Evelyn." "I'm not doing this anymore," she said. Calm, not dramatic, just steady, in a way she hadn't felt in years. "I'm not going to sit in this kitchen and explain to you why I deserve to exist in my own marriage. I can't. I don't want to, so I'm leaving." "You're overreacting," he said. She zipped the suitcase. She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd laid it out hours ago, in hopeful preparation for a dinner that never happened. She walked past him in the doorway. "I'm not," she said. She called the elevator. It came. She stepped in. She watched the door close on the hallway, and the apartment and Damien standing there in the light, with his whiskey glass and his expression of mild inconvenience. The elevator descended 42 floors. The lobby doors opened onto 5th Avenue. The city was cold and bright and indifferent. Evelyn walked out into it. Up. She didn't call anyone that night. Not her mother, not the two close friends from her pre-Damien life she'd slowly let drift, because maintaining friendships had been another casualty of becoming Mrs. Vale. She walked 7 blocks to a hotel she'd stayed in once for a conference, back when she still occasionally attended things in her own name, and she paid for a room on her own credit card, the one in her maiden name that she'd kept for reasons she couldn't have fully explained all through the marriage. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed. She thought about calling someone. She thought about crying. She thought about all the years and all the small surrenders and all the Tuesday mornings she'd told herself it was fine. Then she picked up her phone and looked up bus tickets. She needed to go somewhere nobody would know her as Damien Vale's wife. She needed to start. She chose a town called Millhaven. It was in upstate New York, an hour from the Vermont border, in a part of the state that had once been industrial and was now in that long, ambivalent limbo between what it used to be and whatever it was becoming. It had a river, it had a diner, it had cheap rent and an arts council that had been optimistically established 15 years ago, and now mostly organized a small annual festival that nobody outside the county attended. She found a studio apartment above a hardware store on the main street, 2 rooms and a radiator that banged all winter and a window that faced east, which meant she woke up with light on her face every morning, which turned out to matter more than she'd expected. She got a job at a cafe 2 blocks away. The owner was a woman named Pat, who was 58 years old and had the energy of someone who'd given up caring what people thought of her roughly 30 years ago and had been healthier for it ever since. Pat asked her 3 questions. Could she handle an espresso machine? Was she reliable? Did she have somewhere to stay? Evelyn said yes, yes, and yes. Good enough, Pat said, and handed her an apron. She didn't tell Pat about Damien. She didn't tell anyone about Damien. She was Evelyn Carter in Millhaven. Her name before, her name again. The name that had belonged to the girl with the portfolio under her arm and the stubborn, inconvenient ambition before she'd set it down to become someone's infrastructure. She worked the morning shift, 6 to noon, and she painted at night. The first paintings she made in the studio above the hardware store were ugly. She recognized this even as she was making them. They were ugly in the specific way that work is ugly when it's being made by someone who is in pain and doesn't yet know what to do with the pain except throw it at a canvas. Overworked, unresolved, full of anger that hadn't found its shape yet. She made them anyway. She filled 6 canvases before anything started to resolve. The 7th canvas was different. She'd been working for 3 hours on a Thursday night, exhausted from a double shift, her shoulders aching. She wasn't even really planning the painting. She was just moving, putting paint down, taking it away, seeing what happened underneath. And something emerged out of the process that she hadn't put there intentionally. A figure, barely there, made of negative space more than pigment. A woman defined by what had been removed rather than what had been applied. You could only see her by looking at what surrounded her absence. Evelyn stood back and looked at it for a long time. Then she sat down on the floor of the studio, and for the first time since she'd left the penthouse, she cried. Not because she was broken, because something had come out of her that was true in a way she hadn't been able to be true in a very long time. She was still in there. All those years of being invisible, of being made small, of being furniture in someone else's curated life, they hadn't actually erased her. They'd just buried her. And the painting proved it. She got up off the floor. She washed her face. She went back to the canvas and kept working. The first year in Millhaven was the hardest. Not dramatically. There were no catastrophes, no spectacular failures, nothing that would make a compelling disaster narrative. Just the grinding, unglamorous difficulty of rebuilding a life from the most basic materials. Money was tight in the way that requires genuine management, not the performative caution of wealthy people pretending to budget. She calculated everything. She accepted nothing from Damien. The divorce lawyers had tried to negotiate settlements that would have left her comfortable, and she'd declined them all, which baffled her attorney and horrified her mother. "You have rights," her mother had said on one of their weekly phone calls. "I don't want his money," Evelyn had said. "That's not pragmatic, Evelyn." "No," she'd agreed, "but it's honest." She wanted nothing from that life to follow her into this one, nothing except what she'd made herself. By the end of the first year, she had 12 canvases she believed in. Not 12 great paintings, necessarily. She was still figuring out what she was doing, but 12 honest ones. 12 paintings that were hers, completely. She sent photographs of 3 of them on a Sunday afternoon on impulse to a small gallery in Hudson she'd read about in an arts journal she'd found at a used bookstore. She didn't expect anything. She didn't have expectations anymore in the old, hungry way. She just sent them. The gallery owner wrote back 5 days later. He said the work was striking. He said it had a quality he found difficult to describe, but felt immediately. He asked if she'd be interested in a group show in the spring. She wrote back, yes. She put the phone down. She went to work the next morning, and Pat poured her a coffee and looked at her sideways and said, "You look different today." "I had good news," Evelyn said. "About what?" "About painting." Pat nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd already suspected. "There you are," she said, and went back to the espresso machine. The show in Hudson was quiet. 5 artists, 15 works total, an opening night that drew maybe 60 people, most of them locals. Evelyn's 3 pieces were in the back corner, which she'd expected, and she stood near them for 2 hours with a glass of wine that she barely drank and watched people look. Most people passed by, but 3 people stopped. One of them, a woman in her late 50s, well-dressed in an understated way, silver hair cut close, stood in front of the largest piece for an unusually long time. Then she turned to Evelyn, not knowing she was the painter, and said, "Do you know who made this?" "I did," Evelyn said. The woman looked at her, then back at the painting, then at Evelyn again. "This is extraordinary," she said. Her name was Margaret Holloway. She was a collector, not the trophy-buying kind, not the Damien Vale kind, but the kind who actually lived with the work they acquired, who thought about it, who told other people. She had a network. She had an eye that other people trusted. She bought 2 of the 3 pieces that night, and she made 3 phone calls the following week. What happened after that happened slowly at first, and then not slowly at all. The way change works when the conditions have been right for a long time and someone finally opens a door. A gallery in Albany, then one in Boston, then a collector in Chicago who flew to see the work in person and asked if she'd ever thought about showing in New York. "Not yet," Evelyn said. "When?" "When I'm ready," she said. She became Evelyn Hart. Not in any dramatic declaration, just a quiet, practical decision. Hart was her grandmother's maiden name. It felt right. It felt like hers. She wasn't hiding from anything. She just wasn't carrying the Vale name into a life she was building on different foundations. By year 3, she had left the cafe. Pat had cried briefly, which she denied doing, and told Evelyn that she'd always known she was going to leave and that she was glad she'd stayed as long as she had. "You're good people," Pat said. "Go be good somewhere bigger." By year 4, Evelyn Hart had a waiting list. By year 5, she had a studio in a converted mill building on the edge of Mill Haven. She'd stayed. She liked the river. She liked the light. She didn't need to be in a city to prove something. And her work was in 11 collections across the country, and she had been the subject of a long profile in an arts journal that called her work quietly devastating in the best possible sense. She was 45 years old. She was not invisible anywhere. She didn't think about Damien often. That surprised her. She'd expected the anger to be a longer tenant, but it had left fairly quickly, replaced first by grief and then by a focused clarity that had no room in it for him. She heard things occasionally through channels she couldn't avoid. A mutual acquaintance, a mention in a business column she happened across. She knew he and Serena had been together more or less openly for the past several years. She knew his company had weathered some difficult quarters. She knew he had remarried or was about to. She'd heard it mentioned and had found, when she checked her own reaction, only a mild indifference. She didn't wish him harm. She didn't wish him anything. She was simply somewhere else entirely. The invitation arrived in October. It came from the Holloway Foundation. Margaret had expanded her collecting into philanthropy, establishing a foundation that raised money for arts education in under-resourced schools. The annual gala was the centerpiece of their fundraising calendar, a glamorous evening at the Wentworth Hotel in Midtown, attended by exactly the kind of New York elite Evelyn had once moved through as Damien's wife, and had left behind without looking back. They wanted her work as the evening's centerpiece, a single large-scale installation, 5 connected canvases, around which the evening would be organized. The piece had been commissioned 8 months earlier and was nearly complete. They wanted her there to speak about it. Evelyn had said yes without hesitation. The work was right for the occasion. Margaret's foundation was doing something real. And there was the small private fact, which she noted without making too much of, that the Wentworth Gala would almost certainly be attended by Damien Vale. She wasn't going for him. She wanted to be clear about that, to herself at least. She wasn't building toward a moment. She wasn't plotting. She was simply not afraid of him anymore. And there was something to be said, she felt, for walking through a door that had once seemed closed to you. Not to prove anything to anyone else, but to prove something to yourself. She accepted the invitation. She ordered the emerald dress. She went back to work. The emerald dress had been a deliberate choice. Not because it was dramatic, though it was, and not because it would make her stand out in a room full of women dressed to be noticed. She'd chosen it because it was the color she'd used in the 4th canvas of the installation. A deep, saturated green that she'd mixed herself over 3 afternoons before she got it right, adding a touch of burnt umber to kill the artificiality of it, to make it feel like something living rather than something manufactured. When she'd seen the dress in a small boutique on Warren Street 6 weeks before the gala, she'd stopped walking, gone back, and looked at it for a full 2 minutes before going inside. It was the right color, that was all. She wasn't making a statement. She was just being consistent. That was what she told herself on the train down from Mill Haven, her garment bag in the overhead rack and her sketchbook open on her lap, though she wasn't drawing anything. Just resting her hand on the blank page the way you rest your hand on something solid when the ground feels uncertain. She hadn't been back to New York in 2 years. The last visit had been for the opening at a gallery in Chelsea, not the one where she'd first shown work. That place had closed, but a newer space run by a woman named Diane who had strong opinions about everything and was right about most of them. It had been a good opening, well attended, and she'd felt fine in the city, functional and present. But she'd taken the first train back to Mill Haven the morning after and felt her shoulders drop about 3 inches the moment the city disappeared behind her. New York was not her city anymore. It might never have been, really. It had been Damien's city, and she had lived in it on his terms, and she had left those terms behind at the lobby of 1045th Avenue. Still, the train pulled into Penn Station, and Evelyn picked up her bag and walked through the crowd and felt the familiar voltage of the place. The density of it, the noise, the particular quality of Manhattan light in late October. And she didn't collapse or flee or feel the old constriction in her chest. She felt fine. More than fine, honestly. She felt curious in a way she hadn't expected, the way you feel when you return to a place that once had power over you and realize the power has migrated entirely to your own side of the equation. She checked into the hotel Margaret had arranged, not the Wentworth, where the gala was being held, but a smaller place 3 blocks away that Evelyn had specifically requested because she wasn't interested in being in the same building as the event for 24 hours before it started. She needed the evening to be an arrival, not a prolonged exposure. She set the garment bag on the bed. She opened the window and looked out at the street below. A cab was arguing with a delivery truck. A woman was eating something out of a paper bag while walking fast in heels. A man was standing on the corner talking on his phone with the expression of someone receiving news he'd been dreading. Ordinary city life. Nothing to do with her. She ordered room service, ate it in the armchair by the window, went to bed at 10 o'clock, and slept better than she usually did at home. Margaret called at 9 the next morning. "Tell me you're here," she said, without hello. This was Margaret's way. She'd never bothered with preamble, which Evelyn had come to appreciate enormously. "I'm here," Evelyn said. "I'm having coffee." "Good. The installation looked extraordinary last night. They finished hanging the 5th panel around 7, and I stood in front of it for almost 20 minutes. My assistant thought I was having some kind of episode." Evelyn smiled. "Was it level?" Evelyn. "The 5th panel has a tendency to hang slightly right-heavy. I noticed it when we were, it is perfectly level and it is extraordinary, and I need you to stop worrying about the mechanics and understand that what you made is going to stop people cold tonight." A pause. "Are you all right? You sound careful." "I'm fine." "You know he'll be there." Evelyn took a sip of coffee, set the cup down. "I assumed." He's bringing Serena. I wasn't going to mention it, but then I thought not mentioning it was its own kind of problem. Margaret's voice was matter of fact, but there was care under it, the kind that doesn't dress itself up. I can arrange the seating so that— Don't do that, Evelyn said. Don't arrange anything. I'm not there to manage distance between myself and Damien Vale. I'm there because the work is there. A beat. Right, Margaret said, and the word carried a small weight of something that might have been admiration. 7 o'clock. Cocktail hour starts at 6:30. I'd like you there by 6:15 so you can see the room before it fills up. I'll be there, Evelyn said. She hung up and finished her coffee and looked out the window at the October morning and thought very deliberately about the fifth canvas, about the specific quality of light she'd been trying to capture in the upper left quadrant, the way it wasn't quite dawn and wasn't quite dark, that particular threshold hour when you can't tell yet which direction things are going to go. She thought about the work. She let the work be the thing she was walking toward. Everything else was just weather. She arrived at the Wentworth at 6:14. The hotel was the kind of place that had been grand for so long it had passed through grand and come out the other side into something quieter, beautiful in its bones, unpretentious in the way that only comes from not needing to try anymore. High ceilings, warm amber light, marble floors that had been walked on by enough people over enough decades that they'd taken on a slightly imperfect, lived-in quality that no amount of maintenance could fully polish away. The event staff directed her to the gallery space, a long room off the main ballroom that had been given over entirely to the installation. She walked in alone, before anyone else was there, and stood in the middle of the room and looked. The 5 canvases hung in a gradual arc, close enough together that they read as connected but with enough space between them that each one also held on its own. They were large. The central one was 8 feet wide, and they moved, in sequence, through a kind of emotional progression that she'd spent 4 years arriving at without ever being quite able to explain to anyone's satisfaction. They were about disappearance and return, and the complicated difference between the two. The first canvas was the most figurative, a woman in a space, clearly present but somehow peripheral to the space itself, the architecture asserting itself more forcefully than the human figure. In the second, the figure had moved closer to the center but was still partly obscured, partly background. By the third, the figure and the space had reached a kind of equilibrium, neither dominating, both present. The fourth was where the color shifted, where that deep particular green entered the work for the first time, and the figure had turned, was facing outward, was beginning to occupy the frame differently. The fifth was the one Evelyn felt most complicated about, and therefore most certain about. The figure fully forward, fully visible, fully in possession of the space around her, not triumphant, not performing. Just there, just present, just entirely unambiguously herself. Evelyn stood in front of the fifth canvas for a few minutes. Then she straightened her shoulders, adjusted the small bag on her arm, and walked out to the main room. The crowd began arriving at 6:30 with the reliable precision of people who had been attending events like this for long enough to have developed opinions about the optimal entry time. Evelyn moved through the cocktail hour with Margaret beside her for the first 20 minutes. Being introduced to people whose names she sometimes recognized from the collector world and sometimes didn't. She was good at this now, better than she'd ever been as Damien's wife, which was interesting because she'd spent those years trying to be good at it and failing. The difference, she understood now, was that then she'd been performing a role, and now she was just herself in a room, talking about work she cared about with people who were interested in it. "The piece in Chicago," said a man in his 60s with a strong handshake and the suntan of someone who spent time in actual nature rather than on yachts. "The one from last year's Whitney Biennial Invitational. I had a photograph of it on my desk for 3 weeks before I bought it." "Which one was that?" Evelyn asked. "The Threshold series. Number 4, the red one." You have the red one?" She was genuinely pleased. "I was worried about that painting for a long time. It took me 4 attempts. You couldn't tell," he said. "It looks inevitable." "That's when you know it's finally right," she said. "When it stops looking like work." He laughed, and they talked for a few minutes about the process and about the new installation. And it was a real conversation, the kind where both people are actually present and interested, and Evelyn thought, not for the first time, about what it had cost her to access this. All the years of making herself small, of editing herself into a shape that fit someone else's life. All the years she'd moved through rooms like this one feeling like a visitor on borrowed credentials. She wasn't borrowed anymore. She was the reason the room existed tonight. The thought didn't make her arrogant. It just made her quiet in a certain way. Settled, like a compass needle, finding north. Time. She was talking to one of the Foundation's board members near the entrance to the gallery space when she saw Damien. She'd been expecting the moment, had thought about it, had told herself it would be fine. And it was fine. That was the accurate thing to say. It was fine. Her heart didn't seize, her hands didn't shake. She felt a kind of clean, detached recognition. The way you recognize a landmark that has emotional associations but is still just a landmark. A thing made of stone and history and not a living threat. He walked in with Serena, which she'd also expected. They moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of people who had been going to these things together long enough to have developed a rhythm. Serena slightly ahead, handling the social navigation, Damien following in the cleared space she made, his hand occasionally at her back. He looked well. That was the honest thing. He was 51 now, and the years had treated him the way years tend to treat men who have enough money to manage their health and enough vanity to bother. The silver at his temples made him look more rather than less authoritative, and he'd kept himself trim in that deliberate executive way. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, and a white shirt with no tie, which was the evening's particular code for powerful men who were secure enough not to need the tie. Evelyn watched him for roughly 4 seconds from across the room. He didn't look her way. She turned back to her conversation. It was Serena who came close first. Evelyn had drifted into the gallery space. She always felt more comfortable near the work. It grounded her, and was standing near the second canvas, slightly to the side, when Serena materialized beside her holding a champagne glass and looking at the painting with the focused expression of someone who actually meant it. "These are astonishing," Serena said, to no one in particular, then glanced sideways and seemed to register Evelyn's presence and smiled. The automatic, polished, social smile. "Sorry, hi. Are you connected to the Foundation?" "I made them," Evelyn said. Serena blinked. "You're Evelyn Hart." "I am." Something moved across Serena's face. Genuine surprise, genuine admiration, the kind that can't be faked for the occasion. "I've been following your work for 2 years. The Threshold series especially. I had a print of number 4. A photograph of it, I mean. I keep it in my office." She stopped. Reconsidered something. "I'm sorry. That sounds like something everyone says. I mean it." "I know you do," Evelyn said. And she did know, because she'd spent enough years now being able to read the difference between someone who was performing art appreciation and someone who was actually inside it. "I'm Serena Blake," Serena said, and put her hand out. Evelyn shook it. Serena's grip was firm and direct, and there was nothing in her face except what appeared to be straightforward enthusiasm, which Evelyn found, she examined her own reaction honestly, mostly just strange. Not painful, not enraging, just strange. This was the woman whose presence in her marriage had been the shape of the ending, and she was standing here shaking Evelyn's hand over a painting, not knowing anything. "How do you describe what the series is about?" Serena asked. "I've read 2 interviews and you give different answers both times." "Because I'm not sure I should be the one to explain it," Evelyn said. "Once I explain it, I've closed something that I'd rather leave open." Serena tilted her head. "That's either very wise or a way to avoid the question." "Probably both," Evelyn said, and Serena laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And that was the moment Damien arrived. Bam. He came up beside Serena naturally, the easy movement of 2 people comfortable in proximity, and he had his own drink now and was looking at the central canvas, the large 8-foot one, with genuine attention. "Remarkable," he said. "The scale alone, but it's not just scale. There's something—" He searched for the word, didn't find it, gestured vaguely with his glass. "It earns the size," he finally said. "A lot of work this large feels like it's compensating. This doesn't." "Damien," Serena said. "This is Evelyn Hart. She made them." Damien turned and looked at her. He extended his hand. "Damien Vale. These are extraordinary. You must be very proud of what you've accomplished here." Evelyn shook his hand. "Thank you," she said. His palm was the same. That was the absurd small detail her nervous system decided to deliver to her. His hand felt the same. She dismissed it. She was already dismissing it even as the observation arrived. He smiled at her. A warm, networking smile. The kind he turned on when he was being charming to someone whose work he respected. And he said, "Are you based in New York? I don't think I've seen your work before tonight." "Upstate," she said. "I've been there for several years." "You should be showing here more. Work like this deserves a New York audience." He said it with authority, the way he said most things, like he was identifying something that hadn't occurred to anyone else yet, a piece of overlooked wisdom he was generously providing. Evelyn nodded slightly. "I appreciate that." He did not recognize her. She had known this was possible. People changed over 5 years. She had changed over 5 years. The woman standing in front of him was wearing an emerald dress and had spent half a decade becoming someone entirely different. And the Evelyn he'd known had been so carefully and gradually rendered invisible that he'd stopped actively seeing her face long before she left. But knowing something is possible and experiencing it are not the same thing. She stood in front of the man she'd been married to for 10 years. She looked at his face while he looked at her work and told her she should show in New York. She watched him not know her, and what she felt, under everything, under the strangeness and the odd compressed grief of the moment, was something close to relief. Because the confirmation was now complete and irrefutable. She had not been imagining it. He had in fact stopped seeing her, long before she packed that suitcase, long before the anniversary dinner that never happened, long before the kitchen and the whiskey glass and the word pathetic. He had simply looked past her so many times and so consistently that she had ceased to register as a person to him. She was not the problem. She never had been. She was just the woman he'd stopped looking at. She excused herself after a few minutes. She had other guests to speak with. Margaret was waving at her from across the room, and moved away from both of them without any drama, any trembling, any of the things she might have imagined feeling if she'd tried to rehearse this moment beforehand. She thought, good, and then she stopped thinking about him and went back to doing her job. The program for the evening was structured around the installation. After dinner, the guests would be invited into the gallery space for a brief talk by Evelyn about the work, followed by a live auction of 4 smaller pieces she'd contributed to the Foundation's collection. The installation itself was not for sale. She'd been clear about that. It would be donated to a museum that served public school students in the Bronx, a decision Margaret had announced in the program notes, and which had already generated several significant pledges from people who apparently responded well to the combination of excellent art and unpurchased goodwill. Dinner was long in the way that these evenings are long, not unpleasant, but extended, designed to build anticipation and loosen wallets in equal measure. Evelyn was seated at Margaret's table, positioned near the center of the room, and she ate more than she usually did at these things, which she took as a sign that she was genuinely calm and not just managing herself. She could see Damien's table from where she sat. 7th table from the left, near the window, positioned in the upper tier of the room's informal hierarchy. Not the most prominent table, but close. He was talking to the man next to him with his characteristic focused energy, the kind of attention that made people feel momentarily exceptional. Serena was across from him, deep in conversation with a woman in red who Evelyn recognized vaguely as someone in finance. They looked like what they were, 2 successful, attractive people who had built a comfortable life together on the foundations of a situation that had cost someone else a great deal. She felt no bitterness about this. She was genuinely surprised, at moments, by how little bitterness she felt. It had been real once. She remembered the anger of the early months in Mill Haven, the nights when she'd lain awake cataloging every specific indignity, and the fury of it had been almost useful, had powered things. But it had burned through. Things do, when you let them. What was left was something more like clarity. She had needed to leave. She had left. Everything that had happened after was hers. After dinner, the guests moved into the gallery space, and Evelyn watched from just outside the archway as 200 people flowed in and arranged themselves in front of the 5 canvases. She watched the room change. It happened the way it sometimes happened with the work. She'd seen it before, not always, but often enough to know it was real and not wishful thinking. A crowd walking into an exhibition often maintains its noise and momentum for several minutes before the work starts to cut through. But this room, in front of these 5 canvases, went quiet in under 60 seconds. Not completely silent. It was a gala, not a museum, and people were still talking. But the texture of the room changed, the volume dropped. The quality of attention shifted from social to something more inward. She felt the particular satisfaction of that which has nothing to do with ego. It was just the work doing what the work was supposed to do. Reaching people, making them feel the specific thing she'd been trying to make them feel, which was, you have been here too. You have been the figure in the first canvas, and you can be the figure in the 5th. Margaret appeared at her elbow. Ready? Yes, Evelyn said. She walked into the room. She spoke for about 12 minutes, which she'd been told was the right length for this kind of audience at this stage of the evening. She didn't use notes. She never used notes when she talked about the work, because the minute she reduced it to a prepared statement, it stopped being honest. She talked about the first painting she'd made in the studio above the hardware store, and about the 7th one, the one where she'd understood something had shifted. She talked about the quality of light in Millhaven in the winter, how it came in at a particular angle in the afternoon that had no equivalent anywhere else she'd lived, and how that light had ended up in the 2nd and 3rd canvases in ways she hadn't planned. She talked about the difference between making work out of pain and making work out of the understanding of pain, how the first produces something angry and the second produces something true. She did not mention Damien. She did not mention her marriage. She spoke in the language of art and process and the specific geography of her own experience without naming the specific geography. But the people who had been in certain rooms of their own lives heard what she was saying. She could see it in the room, the particular stillness that came over certain faces. The women especially, though not only the women, who were receiving the work and the words together and recognizing something in the combination that they hadn't expected to find at a charity gala on a Thursday evening. She finished. The applause came up genuinely, the kind that starts before it's fully decided on. She nodded, said thank you, stepped to the side, and then she looked quite involuntarily across the room. Damien was standing near the 4th canvas, the one with the green, with the figure turned outward. He had a drink in his hand and his face had lost its networking composure entirely. He was staring at the painting with an expression she couldn't read precisely from across the room, but which was clearly not what it had been 20 minutes ago. Beside him, Serena had her arms crossed loosely and was looking at the 5th canvas, the woman fully present, fully there. Her expression was harder to read. She was smart enough, Evelyn suspected, to be starting to feel something she couldn't yet name. The auction was about to begin. Evelyn reached for a glass of water from a passing tray. Her hand was steady. The night wasn't over. The auction began at 9:15. 4 pieces, each one a smaller work from the same years that had produced the installation. Not studies or sketches, not secondary material, but fully realized paintings that simply didn't belong to the sequence. Margaret had selected them herself, and her eye was good enough that even removed from the installation's arc, they had their own authority. Each one was expected to go for between $40,000 and $80,000, which was where Evelyn's market had settled in the last 2 years. Comfortably, legitimately, without the inflation of speculation. The auctioneer was a compact, silver-haired woman named Patricia, who ran her own house in the 50s and had the particular energy of someone who understood that an auction was theater as much as commerce, and played that angle accordingly. She moved through the room's attention like she owned it, which for the duration of the evening she effectively did. Evelyn had positioned herself near the side wall, slightly behind the main cluster of guests, which was where she preferred to be during any auction of her own work. Watching people bid was a strange experience. The numbers representing something real about how her life had changed, but also completely disconnected from the physical act of making, which was the part that actually felt like hers. She watched the room rather than the auctioneer. The first piece, a medium canvas, blue-green tones, a window with the light coming through it wrong side up, or what appeared to be wrong side up, until you looked long enough to realize the image was exactly right, and your expectation had been the problem. Opened at $35,000 and climbed steadily to $62,000. The room was warm with it. The crowd had the particular looseness of people who'd eaten well and drunk well and were feeling generous in the expansive way that comes from the combination of excellent work and open bar. Evelyn watched Damien from the far side of the room. He was still near the fourth canvas, though the crowd had thickened around him. He'd stopped pretending to have a conversation. He was looking at his paintings, moving his gaze from one to the next in the sequence, the way you retrace a path when you're trying to figure out where you made a wrong turn. There was something deliberate about it, something slightly separate from the social activity filling the rest of the room, and she noticed it because she'd spent 10 years learning to read the texture of his attention. She looked away before he could feel the weight of it. The second piece sold for $71,000 to a woman in the front who hadn't hesitated past the opening bid and dispatched a competing bidder with the brisk efficiency of someone used to getting what she decided on. The third piece, Evelyn's personal favorite of the four, a smaller canvas, 8 by 10, almost entirely in ochres and deep reds, a woman's back as she stood in what appeared to be a doorway, but was actually a threshold between two qualities of light, opened at 40 and moved slowly. The crowd was settling, recalibrating, and there was a lull in the bidding that Patricia navigated with practiced patience, drawing out the hesitation with the right amount of silence. That was when Damien began bidding. He came in at $60,000 on the third piece, and Evelyn felt the specific quality of her own stillness change. Not alarm exactly, more like the sensation of a weather system shifting. You feel the pressure drop before you see the clouds. He raised his paddle with the particular casualness of a man who is accustomed to winning things by simply continuing to want them. The gesture was barely a movement, just a slight lift of the wrist, but Patricia saw it and the room followed and the number climbed. 70,000. 80. The woman who'd bought the second piece dropped out at 85. A man at the back table came in at 90 and Damien countered at 95 without a pause. Evelyn stood very still against the side wall. He was buying the piece because it was good. That was the most likely explanation and probably the true one. He'd entered the evening without knowing who made the work, had been moved by it the way a great many people in the room had been moved by it, and was now doing what wealthy men do when they encounter something they want, acquiring it. There was no certainty that it was anything more complicated than that. But she watched his face as he bid, and something in it was not entirely consistent with the easy, evaluative expression of a collector making a purchase. There was a set to his jaw that she recognized, a kind of focused, slightly pressured quality that she associated not with desire, but with something closer to the need to resolve a feeling he didn't know how to sit with in any other way. He'd always bought things when he was unsettled. It was one of the things about him she'd understood and never said out loud. The bidding reached $110,000 and the room had quieted to the specific quiet that accompanies serious numbers. Damien raised his paddle at 115. The man at the back table shook his head slightly. Patricia let the pause run its full length, looking for one more entry. $115,000, she said. Do I have 120? Silence. Sold. Applause moved through the room, genuine and warm. Damien nodded once in acknowledgement, the way he always did when he won something. Not triumphant, just confirmed, as if the outcome had never really been in doubt. Evelyn watched him. He glanced across the room in the general direction she was standing, not looking for her specifically, just the ambient scan of someone collecting the room's response. His eyes passed over her position, moved on, then stopped. Came back. Shit. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds, which is both very short and not short at all. He looked at her, and she watched the recognition arrive, not all at once, but in stages, the way you process something your mind is initially unwilling to confirm. She could see it happening, the slight narrowing, the reassessment, the reaching backward through years to a face he'd stopped actively maintaining in memory. She didn't help him. She didn't look away either. She just stood there, steady, the way the fifth canvas was steady, fully present, fully there, not performing anything. She watched him understand. His color changed. It was subtle, but in that lit room it was visible. A draining, a change in the quality of his skin, the kind of thing that happens when the body registers a shock before the mind has finished processing it. He was holding his champagne glass, and she watched his grip on it tighten slightly, watched his chest move with the breath that was longer than the ones before it. And then Serena said something to him. Something routine, something about the painting he'd just bought, her hand touching his arm. And he turned to her and answered, whatever it was, and the moment closed over. But it had happened. She'd seen it, and he knew she'd seen it, and they both knew what it meant. Evelyn turned and walked into the corridor that connected the gallery space to the hotel's service area, which was quiet, as she'd hoped. She stood there for 2 minutes and did what she'd been doing since the night she'd packed the mid-sized suitcase. She took inventory. She was fine. A little shaken, in the way you're shaken when something you've been expecting arrives anyway. There was something in her chest that was not grief, but was adjacent to grief. The particular heaviness of a thing that is over being over. She took a breath. She took another. She adjusted the narrow strap of her bag. She went back in. The fourth piece was just beginning when she re-entered. Patricia was doing her warm-up, giving the room a moment to refocus, describing the work with the selective accuracy of someone who'd read the catalog notes, but also had genuinely looked at the things she was selling. Evelyn resumed her position along the wall, slightly different placement this time, which put a cluster of guests between herself and the area where Damien was standing. For about 4 minutes, the room was just the auction. The fourth piece opened at 50, climbed to 90 without drama, and was bought by a foundation representative from Boston who'd been in conversation with Margaret's team for weeks. Then she felt him before she saw him. That was the most honest way to describe it, and she knew how it sounded, but it was accurate. There was a shift in the air to her left, a displacement, a slight change in the way the room organized itself around an approaching presence. Damien Vale stepped up beside her. Not close, not intrusively close. He left a proper distance between them. He was holding a fresh drink he didn't appear to be touching. He looked straight ahead at the auctioneer for a moment, and then he said quietly, without turning his head, "Evelyn." Not a question, not entirely a statement, just the word. Her name in his voice, which she hadn't heard in 5 years and which landed, she noted with clinical interest, without the power she might once have expected it to carry. "Damien," she said. They stood side by side and watched Patricia manage the closing applause for the fourth piece. "How long have you known I was going to be here tonight?" he asked. "Since Margaret told me the guest list. About 3 weeks ago." He absorbed this, nodded once. "And you came anyway." "It's my installation," she said. "Why wouldn't I come?" He didn't have an immediate answer for that. She could feel him working through something. The recalibration of a man who'd walked into an evening with one understanding of the room and was now standing inside a completely different one. "I didn't recognize you," he said. It came out slightly more raw than she suspected he intended. "I know. I was standing 3 feet from you. I looked right at you and I—" He stopped, picked something up inside himself that he'd let drop. "You look—" Again he stopped. Whatever he'd been about to say, he seemed to decide it wasn't the right thing. He tried again. "The work is extraordinary, Evelyn. I mean that." "I know you do," she said. "You've always had a genuine eye for what's good." That was never the problem. Something crossed his face at that. Not a wince exactly, but a compression, a registering. "I didn't know it was you," he said again, and this time it sounded less like information and more like something he was trying to fully absorb. "When I bought the piece just now, I didn't—" "I know." "I would have—" "Would you?" she said. The question landed between them. He didn't answer. She hadn't expected him to. Serena found them 3 minutes later. She came through the thinning crowd with the acute social radar of a woman who'd spent 20 years reading rooms, and Evelyn watched her face run through its own rapid calculations the moment she registered the two of them standing together. The stillness of it, the particular proximity of two people in conversation they didn't want interrupted. To her credit, she didn't retreat. She came forward and stood beside Damien and looked at Evelyn directly and said, "I'm sorry. I don't think we were properly introduced earlier. I'm Serena Blake." "I know," Evelyn said. Something moved in Serena's expression, a small, careful tightening. "Have we met before? Outside of tonight?" "No," Evelyn said. Not directly. She watched Serena try to locate the source of the odd flatness in that answer. Watched her look at Damien quickly, just a glance, looking for information and finding his face giving her nothing useful. Watched her look back at Evelyn and make a quick, intelligent pass at the possible explanations. She was getting there. Evelyn could see it. The way the pieces were beginning to align, not fully, not yet, but moving in the right direction. Serena Blake had not lasted 15 years in Damien Vale's world by being slow. "How do you know Damien?" Serena asked. The question was politely phrased and precisely aimed. "We were married," Evelyn said, "for 10 years. The gallery space had reached the comfortable post-auction noise of an event beginning its social wind-down, glasses clinking, conversation re-expanding into the space the auction had temporarily organized. Around them, people moved and talked and laughed at the normal volume of a successful evening. Serena stood very still. She turned to Damien. He was looking at the floor, not ashamed, exactly, more like a man who has realized he is in a geometry he did not account for and is taking a moment to work out the angles. "You're Evelyn Carter," Serena said. Her voice had changed. The polish had thinned. Underneath it was something more real, less managed. "I was," Evelyn said. "I'm Evelyn Hart now." The silence between the three of them lasted just long enough to mean something. Then Serena said very quietly, "I didn't know you were an artist." "He didn't either," Evelyn said, toward the end. Nint. It was not a theatrical moment. It was not what Evelyn had pictured in her darkest early months, in those Millhaven nights when the anger had its full volume. No public scene, no dramatic reckoning, no humiliation in front of an audience. Just three people standing near a large painting in a Manhattan hotel, two of them reconfiguring their understanding of the evening, and one of them very, very steady. Damien said, "We should talk." "We are talking," Evelyn said. "I mean," he glanced around at the room, at the nearby guests, at the particular exposure of the location. "Not here." "There's nothing that requires a different location, Damien." "Evelyn." His voice had dropped, and she recognized the register, the one reserved for private negotiations, for conversations he wanted contained. "I want to say something." "Then say it." He looked at her for a moment, fully, the way he hadn't in their last several years of marriage, the way she'd been wanting him to look at her across a decade of being looked past. She felt it, and noted it, and did not let it do what it might once have done. "I didn't understand what I had," he said. "I understand that now. Seeing this," he gestured at the room, the canvases, the evidence of 5 years of a life built entirely from her own material. "I didn't see you. I know I didn't see you. He stopped. "You're sorry," she finished, not unkindly. "I know. And I believe you, actually. I think you probably are sorry. I think seeing someone you discarded turn into something extraordinary has a way of producing that feeling quite reliably." His jaw tightened. "That's not fair," he said. "Isn't it?" "I'm not saying the regret isn't real." "I'm not saying it isn't either," she said. "I'm saying the regret and the apology are yours to have and mine to do nothing with. That's all." "I genuinely don't need them, Damien. Not because I'm performing some kind of triumphant indifference. I'm not performing anything. I'm just telling you the truth. I don't need anything from you." Serena had taken a small step back. Evelyn noticed it. The physical language of someone removing themselves from a scene they'd understood too late was not theirs to be in. There was something almost decent in it. Almost. "I should," Serena began. "You don't have to go," Evelyn said. "This isn't a confrontation, I promise." Serena stayed, but the careful social composure had fully dissolved. She looked for the first time that evening like an ordinary person in an uncomfortable situation rather than a publicist managing an event. "I want you to know," Serena said carefully, "that I didn't know the full picture of what the marriage was like, of what Serena." Evelyn said her name simply, without heat. "What you know or didn't know about your part in any of this is between you and your own conscience. I'm not here to adjudicate that." She paused. "I mean that genuinely. I'm not saying it to be cutting. I made my peace with all of it years ago." Serena looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face that might have been relief, except it was complicated by something else. The slight, unmistakable discomfort of a woman who was confronting, possibly for the first time, the specific weight of what she'd stepped into. Margaret appeared at Evelyn's elbow with the unerring instinct of a woman who monitored social temperatures the way a sailor monitors weather. "Evelyn," she said, warmly but with a slight edge of inquiry, "I see you've been introduced to some of our guests." "We were acquainted," Evelyn said, A while ago. Margaret looked at Damien, then at Serena, then back at Evelyn, and the calculation behind her eyes moved with visible speed. She had the good judgment not to ask. Patricia would love a word with you about the next steps for the installation's transfer to the Bronx Museum, she said, when you have a moment. I have a moment now, Evelyn said. She turned back to Damien and Serena, looked at them both calmly. Enjoy the rest of the evening, she said. And she meant it, not sarcastically, not with the satisfied cruelty of victory, but plainly, as someone who had said what she'd meant to say and was finished with it. She walked away from them alongside Margaret and did not look back. Patricia, the auctioneer, turned out to want only about 4 minutes of her time. A logistics question about the installation's insurance valuation during transport, which Evelyn answered and which required her to consult a document on her phone, which gave her 2 minutes of something practical to focus on while her nervous system finished processing the last 20. When Patricia moved on, Evelyn stood alone for the first time that evening near the entrance to the gallery space and let herself have one unmediated moment. She thought about the kitchen, the dark apartment, the dress she'd worn for a dinner that never happened, the sound of ice dropping into a glass, and then his voice, and then silence. She thought about the hardware store apartment in Mill Haven, and the 7th canvas, and Pat saying, "There you are," over an espresso machine. She thought about 5 years, the sheer quantity of them, not just the work and the accumulation of recognition, but the days, the ordinary days, the ones that were hard and the ones that were just days. The Tuesday mornings that didn't require anyone to hold her hand because she had learned slowly and imperfectly and through a lot of difficulty to be enough ground for herself. She felt the weight of those years, and it was not a sad weight. It was something more like ballast, the kind that keeps a boat upright in rough water. She looked into the gallery space at the 5 canvases. The room had thinned enough that you could see them properly now, the arc of them, the progression, the deliberate movement from the first figure half present in her own space to the 5th figure who was simply, entirely, undeniably there. She'd made that journey. It was on those walls. Debumped. She found a chair near the edge of the room and sat down, which she rarely did at these events, but which her feet were now firmly requesting. A server passed, and she took a water glass and drank half of it. Across the room, she could see Damien standing with a small group of people near the bar. He was performing the social function with the practiced surface ease she knew well, but his posture was off. A subtle thing, a slight forward lean that wasn't his usual uprightness, a quality of being somewhere else behind his eyes. He glanced in her direction twice. The third time their eyes briefly met, he looked away first. Serena was near the far wall with a different group, in conversation with 3 women, but the animation that had characterized her presence earlier in the evening was dimmed. She was present but hollowed of something, moving through the motions of an event she was no longer entirely inside. Evelyn watched them both, not with satisfaction, not with anything that looked like the pleasure of vindication, but with a complicated, honest mixture of feelings that she didn't try to simplify. She had once loved Damien Vale. That was true. Not the desperate, unhinged love that made for better drama, but the ordinary, real kind. The kind that builds from accumulated mornings and shared spaces and the assumption of continuity. She had loved him, and he had stopped looking at her, and she had left. All of that was true simultaneously. And she had, since leaving, built something extraordinary. That was true too. Built it out of pain and stubbornness and those early ugly canvases and Pat's espresso and Margaret's phone calls and the specific October light in Mill Haven that had no equivalent anywhere. She didn't need him to understand the weight of what he'd let go. But standing in this room, in this dress, in front of the proof of 5 years she'd made entirely on her own terms, she felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't fully expected to feel. Not victory. Nothing as clean or simple as that. Something more like completion. A closing of a circle that she hadn't known was still open. The final small piece of a thing she'd thought was already finished. She set down her water glass. Margaret was threading toward her through the remaining guests, and from the expression on her face, restrained but genuinely moved, Evelyn knew the evening had been, by the measures that mattered, exactly what it was meant to be. But before Margaret reached her, someone stepped into her sightline. Damien. He was standing 15 feet away, not approaching, not retreating. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him in 10 years of marriage. Stripped of the negotiating calm, stripped of the casual authority, stripped of the performance of being someone who had everything managed. He looked like a man who understood exactly what he'd done and was only now, fully, beginning to live inside that understanding. She held his gaze. She didn't smile. She didn't offer him anything. Not forgiveness, not disdain, not the cold satisfaction of his suffering, just her own steady, level presence. Then Margaret arrived, and people moved, and the geometry of the room shifted, and Damien Vale was behind her. The next thing she needed to deal with was not him. It was the morning. Her train back to Millhaven, the studio, the new work waiting, the new canvas she'd been thinking about for 3 weeks that had nothing to do with this evening and everything to do with what came after it. But the evening was not quite done. Across the room, Serena had gone still in a way that was different from her earlier stillness. She was staring at the 5th canvas, the woman fully there, fully present, with an expression that was too complicated and too private to name from a distance. And something in the way she was standing, the slight hunch of her shoulders, the way her champagne glass hung forgotten at her side, made Evelyn think that whatever Serena Blake was realizing in front of that painting, she was going to carry it with her for a long time. Some reckonings don't need an audience. Some land in the quiet, with no one watching, in front of a painting in a hotel ballroom on a Thursday evening in October. And they are the ones that stick. Margaret walked her out of the gallery space at 10:40 with the quiet efficiency of someone extracting a person from a situation before the situation had a chance to become something else. It wasn't necessary, exactly. Evelyn was fine, she was genuinely fine. Her feet hurt, and she was tired in the specific way that comes from being emotionally present in a room for 4 hours, rather than from anything dramatic. But she let Margaret do it because Margaret needed to do something useful, and because the corridor was cooler and quieter, and she was glad for both. That was handled with extraordinary grace, Margaret said, once they were in the hallway. I didn't do anything particularly graceful, Evelyn said. I just told the truth and then walked away. That is extraordinarily graceful. Most people would have done considerably more. Margaret handed her a glass of water from a tray carried by a passing staff member with the seamless reflex of someone who had spent decades managing events. He looked like a man who'd been hit by a car. He'll be fine, Evelyn said. I'm not certain he deserves to be, Margaret said pleasantly. Evelyn smiled at that, a small, tired, genuine smile. It doesn't really matter whether he deserves it or not. That's not my department anymore. They stood in the corridor for a moment, the sounds of the winding Gala muffled through the walls. Somewhere down the hall, a staff member was beginning the quiet work of dismantling the cocktail hour setup. The evening was in its last half hour, the formal program finished, the crowd beginning the slow migration toward exits and car services. The museum's transport team is confirmed for Thursday, Margaret said, moving them gently into logistics because she understood that Evelyn needed something practical to stand on. They'll wrap the canvases on site. I've asked them to let you be there when they take down the 5th one. Thank you, Evelyn said. Yes, I'd like that. And there have been 3 inquiries tonight about future commissions. I told them all to contact Diane. Good. One of them was from a board member of the Meridian Arts Center in Chicago. They're building a new wing. Evelyn absorbed that. Set it aside for later. Okay. Margaret studied her face. You should go back to the hotel. In a few minutes, Evelyn said. I want to say goodnight to the room. Margaret nodded, squeezed her arm once, a brief, practical gesture of affection, and let her go. The gallery space had thinned considerably. Maybe 40 people remained, clustered in small groups. The energy of the room changed from the charged attention of the auction to something more relaxed and conversational. The canvases still held the space. They would until the transport team came Thursday, and a few people were still engaged with them directly, standing close or standing back, the kind of sustained looking that Evelyn had learned to distinguish from the performed looking that was really about being seen to appreciate art. She moved through the room quietly, stopping twice to speak briefly with guests who'd been waiting for a more relaxed moment to approach her, and both conversations were good ones. Specific, engaged, about the actual work rather than the social performance of responding to work. She was near the exit when she almost walked directly into Serena. Not Damien, Serena alone. She was standing just outside the archway that led back into the main ballroom, holding her phone loosely in one hand and a jacket over her arm. She'd clearly been on her way somewhere and had stopped, and the reason she'd stopped was she'd been looking at the fifth canvas from the threshold of the room, unable to fully leave it. They nearly collided, a few inches between them. Both of them stepped back. "Sorry," Serena said. She looked back at the painting. "I keep coming back to it." "People do," Evelyn said. "It's the fifth one specifically." Serena's voice was different now than it had been at any other point in the evening. Quieter, the professional ease gone completely. She sounded like herself, whoever that was, which Evelyn suspected was something Serena Blake didn't often allow in rooms like this. "The figure in the last one, there's something about the way she's standing." "She's just standing," Evelyn said. "That's what I mean." Serena looked at her with something that was not comfortable but was at least honest. "That's the whole thing, isn't it? She's just standing, not posing, not performing, not waiting for anyone, just there." "Yes," Evelyn said. A pause. "I've been thinking," Serena said, "about what you said earlier, that you made your peace with everything years ago." "I did." "I believe you. I think that's actually what makes it—" She stopped, started again differently. "I have a question, and you absolutely don't have to answer it." Evelyn waited. "When you left, when you packed the bag and walked out, were you afraid?" The question was genuine enough that it deserved a genuine answer. Evelyn considered it for a moment. "Terrified," she said. "I didn't have a plan. I had one suitcase and a credit card and about $9,000 in an account he didn't know existed. I was 40 years old, and I'd spent the last decade becoming someone's background. I was absolutely terrified." Serena absorbed this. Something in her face shifted. Not breaking, just moving. "But you went anyway," Serena said. "I went anyway," Evelyn agreed. They stood in the archway for a moment in the particular silence of two women who have said something real to each other across a context that did not require them to. Then Serena straightened. The jacket went back over her arm. "Thank you for tonight," she said. "The work it's the best thing I've seen in years. I mean that without reservation." "I know," Evelyn said. And she did, and the knowing was uncomplicated. Serena nodded once and walked away through the ballroom, and Evelyn watched her go and thought, whatever that woman does with this night, wherever it lands in the particular accounting of her life, it will land somewhere that matters. She's too smart for it not to. She didn't feel sorry for Serena. She didn't feel anything particularly uncomplicated about her, but she felt a kind of acknowledgement, one human being to another, across the specific strange terrain of an evening that had asked a great deal of everyone in it. She was 30 feet from the hotel's main exit when she heard him. "Evelyn." She stopped, closed her eyes for 1 second, just one, just enough to collect herself, and turned around. Damien was crossing the lobby toward her, not rushing, but with purpose, the way he moved when he'd decided on something. His jacket was unbuttoned, and his earlier composure was only partially reconstructed. He'd been waiting, she understood. He'd let the room clear around him, and he'd found his moment, and he'd taken it the way he took everything. She waited for him to cover the distance. He stopped about 4 feet from her, close enough that this was a real conversation, far enough that he was at least reading the room correctly. "I need 10 minutes, he said. "You don't need 10 minutes, she said. "You need to feel like you've had a chance to say something, which isn't the same thing." "Evelyn, I'll give you 10 minutes, she said, "because it's late and I'm tired and it's cleaner this way." There was a small seating area off the lobby, 2 chairs and a low table between 2 potted plants that no one had used all evening. She walked to it and sat down. He followed and sat in the opposite chair. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at the floor for a moment before looking up at her. "I've thought about you," he said, "more than you'd probably believe." I believe it," she said. "Thoughts are cheap, Damien. I don't say that to be mean. I mean it literally. Thoughts don't cost anything. They don't require you to do anything differently." He absorbed this without deflecting it, which surprised her slightly. "When I bought the painting tonight," he said, "I hadn't recognized you. I bought it because it was extraordinary, because it had something in it that I—" He stopped. It had something in it that I recognized without knowing why. And then I looked across the room, and there you were, and it just... A short exhale. It hit me very hard. I know it did. I watched it happen. He was quiet for a moment. How long have you been using heart? About 4 years. Your grandmother. The fact that he remembered that was a small knife, clean and quick, and she let it pass through her. Yes, she said. The work is, Evelyn, it's the best thing in that room by a significant margin. The installation especially. 5 years of that. I didn't know you had that in you. She looked at him steadily. Yes, you did. You saw one of my paintings in a gallery, and you stood in front of it for 4 minutes, and then you bought it. You knew exactly what was in me. You just stopped caring. He didn't argue with that. The honesty of it seemed to take some of the structure out of him. He sat back slightly, and for a moment he just looked tired and 51 years old in an expensive suit. I was an awful husband, he said. You were, she agreed. I don't have an explanation for it. That isn't essentially just an excuse. No, she said. You don't. I'm saying I know that. Good. She said it plainly, without heat. Knowing it is worth something. Not to me necessarily, but for yourself it's worth something. He looked at her for a long moment, studying her face the way he hadn't in years of marriage, the way the room had been looking at her paintings all evening. Are you happy? He asked. The question came out slightly unguarded, slightly more naked than his usual register. She considered it honestly. I'm not always happy. I have weeks that are hard. I have work that fails. I get lonely sometimes in a way that's different than other kinds of lonely. She paused. But I'm mine. I'm completely mine. And that's worth more to me than I knew to ask for when I was married to you. He flinched, just slightly. Is there someone? He asked. That's not a question I'm going to answer, she said. Not coldly, just with the clear sense of a line. He nodded. Let it go. To his credit. The painting I bought tonight, he said. If you want it back, I don't want it back. You bought it at a legitimate auction for a charitable foundation. Keep it. She paused. Put it somewhere you'll actually see it. Don't put it in a guest room. Something that might have been a real smile crossed his face, brief and complicated. I'll put it in my office. That's your choice, she said. The 10 minutes was almost up, and she could feel it. The approach of the end of the conversation, the natural closing of the door. There was more he wanted to say. She could see it in him, the weight of accumulated unsaid things that had been building since he'd recognized her face from across a ballroom. But she also knew that most of what he wanted to say was for his own sake rather than hers. And she was not, at this late hour, on this particular night, obligated to receive it. She moved to stand. One more thing, he said. She stayed seated. Serena and I, he started and then chose differently. Things haven't been what I thought they'd be. She looked at him. I'm not telling you that to... He stopped again, started again with different material. I'm not asking for anything. I understand there's nothing to ask for. I just want you to know that the life I traded yours for wasn't the life I thought it was going to be. Evelyn sat with this for a moment. She thought about the right thing to say. Not the kind thing, not the cruel thing, but the true thing, which was neither of those exactly. I'm not surprised, she said. You were in love with the idea of Serena the way you were in love with the idea of me at the beginning. The problem isn't who the woman is. The problem is the looking past. You do it eventually to everyone, Damien. I don't think you know you're doing it, which doesn't make it better. But I don't think it's malicious. I think you just stop being curious about people once they stop being new. He was very still. That's probably the most accurate thing anyone has ever said about me, he said. I know, she said. I had 10 years to work it out. Said. She left him in the lobby chair. Not cruelly. She said goodnight clearly, and she meant it, and his goodnight back to her had a quality of finality that she recognized as genuine, as something being closed rather than merely paused. She thought, walking out through the hotel's revolving door and into the cold October air of the street, that it was probably the most honest conversation she'd ever had with him, which was its own particular sadness, that it had taken the end of everything to produce a beginning of that. The street was quieter than it had been when she'd arrived. A cab moved past. A couple walked quickly, holding hands. The city doing its regular work of being enormous and continuous, regardless of whatever small human dramas were resolving themselves inside its buildings. Evelyn turned up her collar and started walking. Whoa. She did not sleep easily that night. This was not a surprise. The evening had asked something real of her, and the body kept score of those things even when the mind was calm. She lay in the hotel room with the window cracked, the distant noise of the city coming through, and let her thoughts do what they needed to do rather than trying to organize them. She thought about Damien's face in the lobby, the tiredness in it, the genuine reckoning of a man who had spent a decade making a series of choices that had seemed, in the moment, like rational optimizations, and had arrived at 51 in an expensive suit in a hotel lobby trying to say something true to the woman he'd made invisible. She felt something for him that she hadn't expected to feel, a kind of impersonal pity, not the soft, forgiving kind that would have surprised her 5 years ago by existing at all. Just the clean, non-attached recognition that his life was genuinely the worse for what he'd done. That was its own consequence. She didn't need to add to it, and she didn't need to alleviate it. She thought about Serena standing in the archway looking at the 5th canvas. She's just standing, as if it were the most remarkable thing in the world. She thought about her mother in Ohio, who would call Sunday morning as she always did, and about what she'd say about the evening. Her mother had the unnerving habit of responding to complicated situations with very simple, accurate sentences. She'd probably say something like, "So you went back and it was fine. Good. Now what? Now what?" There was the Chicago inquiry, the Meridian Arts Center, a new wing. She didn't know the specifics yet, but a building was a different kind of commission than a single piece, a different scale, a different set of problems to solve, and the part of her brain that was always already working had been quietly circling it since Margaret mentioned it. There was the new canvas waiting in the Millhaven studio. She'd been thinking about it for 3 weeks. Not a continuation of the installation series, something different, something that began where the 5th canvas ended and moved forward into whatever territory came after arrival. She had no title for it yet. She had a quality of light and a figure and a sense of movement, not backward, not looking back at anything, just forward into open space, into something that hadn't been named yet because it hadn't been made yet. She thought she'd start it the day after she got back. The radiator in the hotel room clicked inside. She pulled the blanket up. The city noise thinned as the hour grew later. She slept. Thursday came quickly. The transport team arrived at the Wentworth at 9 in the morning. 3 people with soft cases and archival wrapping and the practiced, methodical confidence of people who handled irreplaceable things for a living. Evelyn was there when they arrived, in jeans and the kind of sweater she actually worked in, which was a significant departure from the emerald dress and which felt immediately correct. Margaret was there too, in a wool coat and sensible boots, holding 2 coffees. "You look more like yourself," Margaret said, handing her one. "I looked like myself Tuesday night too," Evelyn said. "You looked like a version of yourself I hadn't seen before. This version is the one I know." Margaret sipped her coffee. "Did you sleep?" "Eventually." "Good enough?" Margaret looked at the canvases which the transport team was beginning the careful process of assessing for wrapping. "The Meridian people called me this morning. They want a preliminary conversation next month." "I know. I've been thinking about it." "And?" "And I want to know more about the space before I say yes or no. What kind of light does it have? What the walls are like? Whether the architecture has something to say or whether it's just a container." Margaret nodded. "I'll find out. Also, I want to meet the director. Not on the phone, in person." "I'll arrange it." They stood in comfortable silence while the transport team worked. The room looked different in morning light. The gala atmosphere entirely gone. The chairs and tables cleared away. The space returned to something more neutral and functional. The canvases on the bare walls in the plain morning light. She looked at the 5th one. In this light, without the event surrounding it, it was quieter. More itself. The figure in it, the woman who was simply there, simply present, simply standing in a space that was entirely hers, looked, in the honest October morning, less like a statement and more like a record. Less like an argument and more like a fact. This happened. This is what it looks like when someone comes back to themselves. The lead transport tech, A tall woman named Riva, with close-cropped hair and nitrile gloves, came over to Evelyn. "We'll do the others first," she said. "Save the fifth for last, like you asked. You want to watch the whole process or just the takedown?" "Just the takedown," Evelyn said. Riva nodded and went back to the first canvas. Evelyn drank her coffee and watched. Oh. While the first 3 canvases were being wrapped, her phone buzzed. She looked at it without expectation, a reflex, and saw a name she hadn't seen on her screen in 5 years. Damien Vale. She stood looking at it for a moment. Outside in the corridor, a hotel staffer pushed a cart. The transport team worked quietly, the sounds of soft cases and careful movements. She answered. "Damien? I'm sorry to call." His voice was careful. Early morning careful, the kind that hadn't been performing for anyone yet. "I know, it's fine. I'm at the hotel watching the transport team." "Right. Good." A pause. "I wanted to say, I spent most of last night not sleeping, and I kept coming back to the conversation in the lobby, and I think—" He stopped, started differently. "I don't think I said what I actually needed to say." "What did you need to say?" "That I'm sorry, not for the general shape of things, for the specific thing, for that night on your anniversary, for what I said to you." A pause. "You remember what I said?" "Yes. I've thought about it more than once over these years. I'm not going to pretend I haven't. And I've never been able to justify it to myself. Not the word specifically. That was—" His voice shifted slightly. Something in it that cost him. "That was unforgivable, as a characterization of you. Of anyone." Evelyn stood very still near the wall. She felt the word land, pathetic. She hadn't forgotten it exactly. She'd filed it, the way you file things that have to be stored somewhere but can't be in active circulation. And hearing him name it circumspectly, without saying it again, was its own strange thing. "Why now?" she asked. "Why this morning?" "Because last night I watched 200 people stand in front of your work and be moved by it, and I thought about the woman who made those paintings, and I thought about what I said to her in that kitchen, and I couldn't—" He stopped. "I couldn't leave that in the lobby conversation. I needed you to know I know what I said." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I mean that. It matters, not because I need the apology to feel better about myself. I sorted that out years ago. But because it's the honest thing, and you're capable of honesty, and I'd rather know that than not." That's, a small exhale. "I'll take that." "How are you?" she asked. Not softly, just plainly, the question of one adult to another. "I'm—" A pause that contained something real. "I'm going to be all right. Eventually. I think I have some things to work out." "I think you do," she agreed. "Serena and I had a very long conversation last night." Evelyn didn't ask about the content of it. That was not hers. "I hope you're both honest with each other," she said. "I'm trying to be." Another pause. "Evelyn," he said her name quietly. "The painting I bought on Tuesday night, the woman at the threshold, the one looking toward the light. I hung it in my office this morning, first thing." She hadn't expected that, the speed of it. She found, honestly, that it moved her. Not toward him, not into anything she'd moved away from, but just as a human fact. He'd carried the painting home and hung it on the wall before dawn. "Good," she said. "I keep looking at it." "That's what it's for," she said. She looked up across the room. Riva and her team had wrapped 4 canvases and were moving to the 5th. They would take the 5th one down in a few minutes, and it would go to the Bronx, to a building full of children who were being taught that making things was a form of thinking, that art was not decoration but investigation, that you could take what you'd been given, however little or difficult, and make something honest out of it. She wanted to watch that. "I have to go," she said. "They're taking down the last canvas." "Of course." A pause. "Thank you for picking up." "Take care of yourself, Damien," she said. She meant it. She hung up. Riva waited until she came closer before beginning the takedown of the 5th canvas. She appreciated that, the small consideration of it. The process was methodical and careful. Gloved hands, archival foam, soft cotton wrapping, the reversal of the hanging that had taken 4 people nearly 2 hours on the night before the gala. What had gone up with difficulty came down with the practiced efficiency of people who knew what they were doing. Evelyn watched the figure disappear beneath the wrapping. She felt the completion of it. Not loss, nothing so clean as loss, but a genuine closing. The piece was leaving her hands and entering the world in the way she'd intended, going to a place where it would do the thing she'd made it to do. She thought about a girl, 12, 13, however old she would be, walking into a new museum wing on a school trip and standing in front of this painting for the first time and seeing a woman who was simply standing, simply there, simply in possession of her own space. She thought about what that might mean to someone who hadn't learned it yet. She thought about the version of herself who hadn't learned it yet either. Margaret appeared beside her and they stood together and watched the team carry the last wrapped canvas out through the archway. The room was empty now, just walls with the faint ghost marks of where the hangers had been. Light coming through the windows, the smell of coffee from the cups they were both still holding. "What do you need?" Margaret asked. Evelyn looked at the empty wall where the 5th canvas had been. "Train back to Millhaven," she said. "My studio. And a new canvas." "That's everything?" "That's everything," she said. And it was. She was on the 215 out of Penn Station, watching the city give way to the upstate landscape she'd come to think of as hers, the river appearing alongside the tracks, the hills going gold-brown with October, the specific quality of sky that was not Manhattan sky, wider and less contested and more honest about its own weather. Her sketchbook was open on her lap. She wasn't drawing yet. She was just thinking with her hand on the blank page, the way she'd been doing on the way down. But this time the page didn't feel uncertain beneath her palm. It felt like the beginning of something. She picked up her pencil. The pencil moved before she'd consciously decided what to draw. That was how it always worked when something real was coming. Not the deliberate, planned beginning of a project she'd already mapped out in her head, but the involuntary kind. The hand ahead of the mind. The mark on the page that was already more right than anything she could have arrived at through intention. She let it happen. The train moved north through the October landscape, and she didn't look down at what she was making, just kept her eyes on the window and let the pencil find its own way. When she finally looked, 20 minutes outside of the city, she saw a figure walking forward, not toward anything specific, not away from anything visible, just walking, with the particular quality of movement that belongs to someone who has decided on a direction and is not second-guessing it. The lines were loose. She'd drawn fast, the way she drew when she wasn't supervising herself, but the posture was exact, head level, shoulders neither slumped nor artificially squared, the easy uprightness of a person who wasn't performing anything for anyone. She looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote 2 words at the bottom of the page, very small. "After this." She didn't know yet what that meant as a title. It didn't matter. Titles came or they didn't, and the work existed independent of what it was called. What mattered was the figure, and the direction, and the quality of forward movement that had no performance in it. She closed the sketchbook. The river came into view alongside the tracks, dark and quick in the October afternoon. She watched it move. Millhaven looked the same, which was part of why she'd stayed. The main street with the hardware store, the cafe where Pat still ran the morning shift with the same decisive efficiency she'd had the day she handed Evelyn an apron and said good enough. The converted mill building at the edge of town, her studio on the 2nd floor with the east-facing window, the river 2 blocks over. She walked from the station with her bag over her shoulder and her garment bag folded over her arm and the sketchbook in her hand, and the town received her the way it always did. Without ceremony, without particular notice, just the ordinary ongoing fact of her presence in it. She stopped at the cafe. Pat was behind the counter doing the late afternoon prep, restocking the pastry case with the things that had sold out during the morning and refilling the sugar dispensers in the particular methodical order she'd developed over 30 years of running small food operations. She looked up when the bell above the door rang. "You're back," she said. "Told you I would be," Evelyn said. "How was the city?" Evelyn set her bags down and sat on one of the counter stools. It was what it needed to be. Pat poured 2 coffees without being asked, one for Evelyn, one for herself, and leaned against the back counter. "The fancy Gala thing." "Yes." "And the, you know." Pat made a small, vague gesture that somehow managed to indicate Damien, Serena, the entire 10-year history without naming any of it. Pat had never asked directly about the marriage. She'd received the information Evelyn had given her over 4 years of morning shifts and occasional late conversations, had filed it in the place where she kept things that mattered to her, and had never turned it into something that required management. That too, Evelyn said. And? And it's finished, Evelyn said. Really finished, I think. Not the way it was before, where it was finished, but there was still a thread. Now there's no thread. Pat considered this, drank her coffee. Good. Yes, Evelyn said. Good. They sat in the comfortable silence of two women who had been in each other's orbit long enough not to require constant sound to fill the space between them. The 5th canvas left for the Bronx this morning, Evelyn said. The big one? The last one in the series. Pat nodded slowly. How's that feel? Evelyn thought about it honestly, the way she did with Pat's questions, because Pat asked things she actually wanted to know the answers to and therefore deserved actual answers. Like finishing a book, she said. Not sad, just done and ready for the next one. You already know what it is? I have the first line, Evelyn said. I drew it on the train. Pat smiled. A small private smile, the kind that cost her very little because she didn't deploy it often. Then you're fine, she said. You always know what you're doing once you have the first line. Evelyn picked up the coffee cup. It was the right temperature, the right strength. The cafe smelled like it always smelled, coffee and the particular vanilla of the pastry case, and the underlying note of old wood that the building had been exhaling for 60 years. She was home. What? The studio had the particular smell of a space that had been left but not abandoned. The familiar compounds of oil and turpentine and the cold that had crept in during the days she was gone. Not hostile, just resting, waiting with the patience of rooms that have learned to expect occupancy. She dropped her bags by the door, didn't unpack, walked straight to the large table in the center of the studio, where she kept her materials organized in the slightly chaotic but internally logical way that would look like disorder to anyone else, and was in fact a precise system she'd developed over years. She pulled out a canvas, medium size, not the scale of the installation, not a study either, something in between. The scale of a conversation between two people rather than a speech to a room. She set it on the easel. She mixed nothing yet, just looked at it. The blank canvas had a quality she never took for granted and never wanted to. The complete openness of it, the way it held all the possible paintings simultaneously, all the ways this could go, all the figures and lights and colors that could emerge from its surface over the next days or weeks. She stood in front of it with her arms at her sides and just let herself be in the room with it. The train, the sketch, the figure walking forward with nothing to perform. She picked up a pencil. She worked until 7. Not on the new painting. Too soon. The surface needed more time to be ready. She needed more time to be ready. But on studies. Loose drawings in her sketchbook. Variations on the figures she'd made on the train. Finding the exact quality of the posture. The specific arrangement of weight across the hips that communicated the thing she was trying to communicate. Not triumphant. Not performing the absence of triumph either. Just moving. Just the ordinary, unremarkable, extraordinary fact of a person going forward. Her phone buzzed twice. She looked at it once. A message from Diane, her New York gallerist, asking about the Chicago inquiry and whether Evelyn wanted her to reach out to the Meridian director. Evelyn wrote back, "Yes. Set up a call for next week. I want to hear what the space is like first." She put the phone face down and went back to the sketchbook. The second buzz was a number she didn't have saved. She looked at it without picking it up, and when the voicemail indicator appeared, she put the phone away and let it be for now. She found the figure in the 5th study. Got it. The weight, the posture, the quality of forward without destination. Forward as a mode of being rather than a trajectory toward something specific. She stopped drawing, set the pencil down, put her hands flat on the table, and stood there and breathed. The voicemail was from Serena. She listened to it standing in the studio kitchen with a glass of water, her coat still on from when she'd briefly stepped out for air. The message was short. Serena's voice was different from how it had sounded at the Gala. The public instrument of it fully put down, What was left almost tentative. Evelyn. It's Serena Blake. I got your contact from the foundation. I hope that's all right. I won't take up your time. I just wanted to say something I didn't say on Tuesday night, which is, I'm sorry. I know that's insufficient for what actually happened. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just needed to say it to you directly. A pause. Your work is extraordinary. I think I'll be standing in front of that fifth painting for the rest of my life. Another pause. Shorter. Take care of yourself. Evelyn held the phone for a moment after it ended. She thought about what to do with the message. She could not respond. That would be fine. She owed Serena Blake nothing, and silence was not cruelty. It was just the natural weight of what Serena had participated in. She could respond. She set the phone on the counter and looked out the window at the dark street below. A car moved past. The streetlight made a circle of yellow on the wet pavement. She picked up the phone. She typed, "Thank you for saying it. Take care of yourself too." She sent it. She put the phone down. She didn't know what Serena would do with those 7 words, and she didn't need to. She'd said the thing that was true and proportionate and honest, and what happened next on Serena's side of the equation was Serena's. She called her mother on Sunday morning, as she always did. Her mother answered on the second ring, which was how she always answered, not frantically early, not making anyone wait. Her mother had a fundamental decency about small things like that. "You're back," her mother said. She'd known about the gala, had known Damien would be there. She'd said, when Evelyn had mentioned it in the previous week's call, simply, "All right, call me when you're back." "I'm back," Evelyn said. And it was fine. Better than fine, actually. The work landed the way it was supposed to. And the other thing was, she found the word. Resolved. Finally, actually resolved. A pause on her mother's end, a quiet sound that might have been her setting down a cup. "Did he see you?" her mother asked. "Not at first. He talked to me for 10 minutes about the paintings before he realized who I was." Silence. "Mom," Evelyn said, "I'm here. I'm just—" Her mother's voice had shifted into something quieter. "I'm just thinking about that girl who got on a bus with a suitcase." "She's fine," Evelyn said. "She got somewhere." I know she did. A small, controlled intake of breath that Evelyn recognized as her mother declining to cry. "I know she did. I just think about her sometimes." "Me too," Evelyn said. They sat on the phone together for a moment. "The Chicago thing sounds good," her mother said finally, moving them back to solid ground the way she always did once she'd allowed herself the brief exposure of feeling something. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. "I'm going out there next month to see the space." "You'll know when you see it." "I'll know when I see it," Evelyn agreed. "Are you painting?" "I started something yesterday." "Good," her mother said, with the firmness of someone who understood that painting was the word that contained everything else. "All right, stable, present, moving forward, alive in the right way." "Good." Done. 3 weeks after this gala, a small package arrived at the studio addressed in handwriting she didn't recognize. The return address was a gallery in the West Village, not one she'd shown at, just an address. Inside was a postcard. No letterhead, no gallery branding. On the front, a printed photograph of a painting she recognized immediately. A work by an artist she'd admired for years. A woman painting in a similar emotional territory. The relationship between figure and space, presence and absence. On the back, in small, careful handwriting. "I used to have a print of your Threshold number 4 in my office. I took it down yesterday, not because the work stopped mattering, because I needed to be able to look at it differently. From a new distance. I think you'll understand that. I've started looking for a studio space. S." Evelyn read it twice, set it on the work table, looked at it for a moment. Then she propped it against the base of the easel where she could see it while she worked, and turned back to the canvas. She didn't know what Serena would make in a studio. She had no idea whether Serena had any real capacity for making art, or whether this was the impulse of a woman in the middle of rebuilding herself who had stood in front of a painting at a gala and needed somewhere to put the feeling. Both of those things were legitimate beginnings. Both of them led somewhere, eventually, if you kept going. She picked up a brush. November came to Millhaven with the particular commitment it had out here. Not the tentative New York fall that hedged its bets against Indian summer, but the real thing, decisive and complete. The river went pewter and fast. The trees finished their business with color and got down to the honest bare structure that Evelyn had always preferred, the architecture of things revealed. She worked every day. The new painting was taking a shape that surprised her and didn't surprise her. The figure was there, the forward movement was there, but what was emerging around the figure was not empty space, as she'd initially expected, but a landscape. Not specific, not realist, just the suggestion of terrain, the kind that requires navigation, that has weather and distance in it, that is not hostile and not welcoming, but simply present, simply real, simply the world as it actually is. The figure was walking in actual conditions, not ideal ones. She thought about this one afternoon in mid-November, standing back from the canvas with her arms crossed and a brush still in her hand, and she understood that this was the honest continuation of where the fifth canvas of the installation had ended. The fifth canvas had said, "Here she is, fully present, fully herself." This new painting was saying, "And the world she's present in is not easy, and she's walking in it anyway." Not despite the difficulty, not heroically, just walking. One foot, then the other. The Meridian visit happened on a cold Thursday in late November. She rarely flew, preferred the train for the rhythmic thinking time it gave her. But Chicago in winter with a connection would have eaten most of the day, and she had work she needed to get back to. The museum director was a man named Oliver Chen, 47, with the particular quality of focus she'd come to associate with the people who were actually serious about the intersection of art and community rather than performing it. He met her in the main building and walked her through the existing collection space, and then through the construction corridor into the new wing, which was still in its framing stages, concrete and structural steel, and the particular cold of an unfinished building where the outside air was not quite out yet. "We want the light to be the architecture," he said, standing in the center of what would become the main gallery. "The south wall is going glass, floor to ceiling. The art will live in natural light the way it lives in a studio." Evelyn stood in the unfinished room and looked up. The framing above her opened to a partial view of November sky. Gray, honest, particular. Not dramatic, just real. "What's the community like around here?" she asked. "Around this building specifically." "Mixed," Oliver said. "A lot of working families. High rate of kids who don't have access to sustained arts education. That's the mandate. We're not building a destination institution. We're building a neighborhood one." "How many kids?" "Ongoing access program. We're estimating 800 to 1,000 annually once we're at capacity. School partnerships, weekend workshops, summer intensive." She was quiet for a moment. "The commission would be for the main gallery wall," Oliver said. "The south-facing one, the glass wall side. Whatever you make would be what they walk in and see first. Every one of those kids, every teacher, every parent, every person who comes in off the street." Evelyn looked at the wall. She thought about a 12-year-old girl on a school trip. She thought about the figure in her current canvas walking in real terrain. She thought about what she would have needed to see at 12, and at 20, and at 40, standing in a kitchen in a dark apartment while a man made ice in a glass. She thought about the seventh canvas in the Millhaven studio above the hardware store. The first honest one, the woman made of negative space, visible by her absence. She thought about how far you could travel from the person defined by their absence to the person simply walking forward in real conditions. She looked at Oliver Chen. "I'll do it," she said. He nodded. Something in his face relaxed that she hadn't noticed was held. "What's it going to be?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know the first mark." She didn't go directly to the airport from the museum. She walked for an hour through the neighborhood around the building site. Cold air, winter light, the city at its ordinary weekday pace, people going to and from work, a school letting out 3 blocks over, kids scattering onto the sidewalk with the explosive, uncontainable energy of children released from desks into cold air. She watched them. A girl, maybe 10, who sprinted 30 feet ahead of her group for no apparent reason and then stopped and looked back and laughed. A boy who was walking carefully because he was reading something on his phone while navigating a sidewalk and occasionally and unselfconsciously bumping into his own friends. Two girls in identical coats who were talking with the synchronized intensity of a conversation that had been going for weeks and would continue for years. She watched them and felt something in her chest that was not grief and not nostalgia, and not exactly longing either. More like attention. The particular quality of attention that comes when you understand what something is worth because you know what its absence costs. She'd been the kind of child who needed to see, who needed evidence, visible and real and on a wall somewhere, that the shape of her inner life was not strange or excessive or pathetic, that it was, in fact, the most real thing about her, and that making it visible was not self-indulgence but a kind of honest reporting. She hadn't had that evidence, not always, not reliably. These kids were going to have it. She was going to put it on a wall in a neighborhood museum in a city on a lake, and 800 kids a year were going to walk in and see it. And some of them, not all of them, maybe not even most of them, art didn't work that way. It didn't work with guarantees, but some of them were going to feel the particular recognition of seeing their own interior life reflected back from a surface. And they were going to know, in the wordless, pre-intellectual way that art works before thought catches up, that they were not alone in it. She pulled her coat tighter against the Chicago wind. She started back toward the street where she'd catch a cab to the airport. The flight home was rough through Indiana, a line of weather that made the small plane lurch and drop in the specific way that reminded her the air was not actually a reliable floor, and she sat with her hands in her lap and waited it out without doing anything dramatic about it, which was, she'd come to understand, its own kind of achievement. She'd spent a significant portion of her life waiting out turbulence. She'd gotten good at it. The sketchbook was open on the tray table, but she wasn't drawing. She was thinking in the loose, associative way that long journeys permitted. Not planning, not solving, just letting the mind move through its territories without a destination. She thought about Damien's painting in his office, the woman at the threshold, looking toward the light. She thought about him looking at it in the mornings. She believed he was. She'd heard enough truth in his voice on that Thursday call to believe at least that much. And she wondered what he was doing with what he saw. Whether the looking was changing anything, or whether it was just another thing he owned that had stopped meaning what it meant when he acquired it. She genuinely didn't know, and she found, examining her own investment in the question, that she genuinely didn't mind not knowing. It wasn't indifference. It was the clean, non-attached feeling of having finished something and put it down. Whatever Damien Vale did with the rest of his life, he would do it without her as a variable in the equation. She was no longer the missing piece in his math. She was her own whole number. The turbulence smoothed, the plane leveled. She looked out the window at the dark. Nothing of winter clouds, and felt the particular grace of being between things. Between Chicago and Millhaven. Between the Meridian commission she'd just accepted and the painting waiting on her easel. Between the woman she'd been and the woman she was still in the process of becoming. Not arrived? Never fully arrived, but moving. One foot, then the other. She got home at 11:30. The studio was cold. She'd left the heat turned down while she was gone, and she turned it up and stood in her coat for a few minutes, waiting for the radiator to begin its familiar clanking commentary. She was tired. She should sleep. She went to the easel anyway, stood in front of the canvas in her coat and her travel clothes and looked at what she'd made so far. The figure, the terrain, the light coming from a direction that wasn't quite definable, not overhead, not from the side, just present, the way light is present on certain mornings when you can't locate the source of it, but the world is illuminated anyway. She had maybe another 3 weeks of work left in this one. Then it would be done, and she'd have to decide what to do with it, whether it went to Diane, whether it went into the collection she was holding back for the Meridian Project context, or whether it was simply the bridge between the installation series and whatever the Chicago Commission became. A private work, a transition piece, the painting she made between where she'd been and where she was going. She looked at the figure, still moving, still walking in real conditions, still not performing anything for anyone. She took off her coat. She didn't pick up a brush, too tired. The work deserved her when she was present, and she wasn't present enough tonight. But she stood there for a while longer, just in the company of it, which was its own kind of working. The companionship of the work in progress. The state of being inside a thing that wasn't finished yet. She thought about what Oliver had asked on the construction floor. What's it going to be? And she'd said, I know the first mark. She knew what she'd meant by that, but she hadn't said it out loud, and she turned it over now in the quiet of the studio with the radiator waking up and the night pressing against the east-facing window. The first mark was always the same thing, no matter what she was making. Not a specific line or color or image, just the decision. The deliberate, non-dramatic, entirely personal decision to begin. To put the pencil to the page on a train going somewhere. To pack the mid-sized suitcase with the things that were yours before he existed. To answer a call from a stranger and say yes, and then go back to the work. To walk into a room full of people who hadn't known you existed and stand in the green dress and not shake. To say what was true and then let it be done. To sit in a cold studio in November and decide quietly and without ceremony that what came next was worth making. The first mark was the decision. Everything else was just the work. Yet, she turned off the studio lights at midnight. She walked the 2 blocks home in the cold, her hands in her pockets, her breath making small temporary clouds in the November air. The town was quiet, a light on at the diner at the end of the main street, the one that ran 24 hours and served coffee to the overnight workers at the paper mill, and occasionally to Evelyn herself on the early mornings when she couldn't sleep and needed the particular combination of bad fluorescent light and decent coffee and the reliable presence of other people being quietly awake. She didn't go in tonight. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked through the window at the small, occupied tableau of it. 2 men at the counter, a young woman in a booth with textbooks, the guy behind the counter moving between the coffee station and the back kitchen with the particular efficiency of someone working a shift that would end at 6. Ordinary, unremarkable, entirely human. She looked at it for a moment the way she sometimes looked at the start of a painting. Before the first mark, when the potential was still total and the only thing required was the quality of seeing. Then she walked home. Up the stairs of the building she'd lived in for 5 years, past the door of the neighbor downstairs who kept odd hours and played the radio at a low volume late into the night. She could hear it faintly, something old, something with a piano, and into the small apartment that was hers. Completely, without condition, entirely hers. She didn't turn on many lights, just the lamp by the chair. She sat down, still in her coat, and kicked off her shoes and let the quiet of the place settle over her. On the small table beside the chair, her sketchbook lay open to the drawing she'd made on the train, the figure walking forward, the 2 small words at the bottom, after this. She looked at it. She thought about what it cost to arrive here. Not the 5 years, though they had cost something real and specific, and she didn't pretend otherwise. But before that, the 10 years of being slowly made invisible. The Tuesday mornings of telling herself it was fine. The anniversary dinner that never happened. The kitchen and the glass and the words she'd never forgotten. And then the lobby doors onto 5th Avenue, and the cold and the indifferent city and the bus ticket to a town nobody knew her name in. All of it had been true. All of it had cost what it cost. And here she was, in the lamplit quiet of an apartment above a street in a small upstate town, with paint under her fingernails and a commission in Chicago, and a canvas on the easel that was 3 weeks from finished, and a sketchbook full of the beginnings of what came next. Here she was. The radio from downstairs moved through its late-night content, the piano song ending, something slower beginning, a voice she couldn't make out through the floor, the melody barely there but present. She let her head rest against the back of the chair. She thought, the figure in the 5th canvas was just standing. And she thought, and that was the whole thing. That was exactly, entirely, sufficiently the thing. Not what she'd endured, not what she'd overcome. Not the distance between the woman in the 1st canvas and the woman in the 5th. Just the standing, just the being there, fully, in the space she'd made entirely with her own hands, from materials that had no guaranteed outcome. She closed her eyes. The lamp made a warm circle in the dark room. The radio from downstairs went on playing. Outside, the river moved through the November night the way it had moved through every night she'd been here. Without caring, without stopping, without needing anyone to witness it to justify its direction. She breathed in. She breathed out. Tomorrow she'd go back to the studio. She'd pick up the brush. She'd put one mark on the canvas and then another, and the painting would grow the way things grow when you stop trying to force them and simply show up, day after day, with your hands ready and your eyes open, and the particular faith, not blind faith, not easy faith, but the earned and slightly battered and absolutely real faith of someone who has done this before and knows it leads somewhere. That the work knows where it's going even when you don't. She had the first mark. She had the figure walking forward. She had this room and the lamp and the sound of the radio through the floor. She had, finally and completely, and without anyone's help or permission, herself. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.